Good evening. Welcome to the 2013-2014 Lectures in Catholic Experience. My name is Christina Vanine. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Religious Studies here at St. Jerome's University. I'm the director of the Master of Catholic Thought program, and I am coordinating this year's lecture series. Please, before we get started, can I ask you to turn off anything that you might have in a pocket or a bag or a purse that can beep while we're going through this evening? That would be appreciated. Thank you, Bryn, so much for being in the room. Thank you. On the occasion of the 2014 World Communications Day this past June, Pope Francis spoke about communication needing to be at the service of an authentic culture of encounter. In that message, he said, "Today we are living in a world which is growing ever smaller, and where, as a result, it would seem to be easier for all of us to be neighbors. Developments in travel and communications technology are bringing us closer together, making us more connected, even as globalization makes us increasingly interdependent. Nonetheless, he says, divisions, which are sometimes quite deep, continue to exist within our human family. Our world suffers from many forms of exclusion, marginalization, poverty, to say nothing of conflicts born of a combination of economic, political, ideological, and sadly, even religious motives. In a world like this, media can help us to feel closer to one another, creating a sense of the unity of the human family, which can, in turn, inspire solidarity and serious efforts to ensure a more dignified life for all people. The walls which divide us can be broken down, but only if we are prepared to listen and to learn from one another. A culture of encounter demands that we be ready not only to give, but also to receive. Media can help us greatly in this, especially nowadays when the networks of human communication have made unprecedented advances. So this is what communication in the media is truly about. It is about encounter, about being genuinely attentive to others, learning to look at the world with different eyes, appreciating the richness of human experience. With all these statements about the critical role of the media in facilitating authentic encounter, we are so privileged to have with us this evening Catherine Pepinster, the editor of The Tablet. The Tablet is a British Catholic weekly journal that has been reporting on religion, current affairs, politics, social issues, literature, and the arts since 1840. It is the second oldest surviving weekly journal in Britain after The Spectator, which was founded in 1828. Catherine Pepinster joined The Tablet as editor 10 years ago. Before that, she worked for the British national newspapers, The Independent as assistant news editor and features editor, and then for The Independent on Sunday as a news editor, assistant editor, and then executive editor. Once she became editor, Ms. Pepinster talked about the value of The Tablet for providing a forum for progressive but responsible Catholic thinking, a place where orthodoxy is at home, but ideas are welcome. She has been responsible for the coverage of the death of one pope, the resignation of another pope, 2 papal conclaves, as well as other major international stories such as 9/11 and the Iraq War. Religion is an important dimension of human society that needs to be reported on. So please join me in welcoming Catherine Pepinster to talk to us about how reporting on religion can be a critical contributor to the common good. Catherine Pepinster.
Thank you very much, Christina. And could I say, ladies and gentlemen, how pleased I am to be here and to thank Christina and everybody here at at St. Jerome's for such a warm welcome today. I've been to Canada many times in the past. I even lived in Montreal at one time, but somehow or other I never managed to get further west than Ottawa, so that was a big gap, and so I'm delighted I've just got that bit further west. I hope you'll bear with me and that I won't see you nodding off, as we know sometimes happens at Mass. There was, I'm told, a priest who used to send people to sleep quite regularly with his homilies. And when he died at the same time as a taxi driver, and they arrived at the pearly gates together. And St. Peter told the cab driver to go straight through, and the priest was pretty put out at this. And he asked, well, why? What's he done? What's so great about him? What about me? All these times I've said Mass, I've preached. And St. Peter said to him, yes, you preached. And people fell asleep. But when that driver got in his cab with those passengers of his, boy, did they pray. So I hope you'll neither be praying for it to end or falling asleep. So, can two words change the Catholic Church, or at least perceptions of it? You can see there that picture taken on March the 13th, 2013, after the white smoke had appeared, the bells of St. Peter's had rung, and Cardinal Jean-Louis Taurin, the senior cardinal, had appeared on the balcony to say, Habemus Papam. And then Cardinal Jorge Bergoglio stepped forward and said to the church and the world, Buonasera. And then he bowed, and the crowd went wild. And really, the world has been doing so ever since. Pope Francis, as he became known to us, has been Person of the Year for the New Yorker magazine, for Time, and for the gay magazine Advocate. His picture appears constantly in the media. He has nearly 4 million followers on Twitter. And for those of you who haven't seen it, there we have the Twitter page. 3 million young people crowded Copacabana Beach in Rio last year for his celebration of Mass at World Youth Day. The Francis phenomenon tells us much about the media and its relationship to religion, and it tells us much about the state of Christianity and Catholicism in particular. In this lecture, I want to examine the way in which religion is reported and the challenges that journalists face in trying to make sense of covering religion, from the personalities involved to the drama surrounding it and to the more abstruse areas of theology. One of the key issues that affects reporting on religion is the attitudes that people in the church, particularly senior clerics, have towards the media. I want to examine these attitudes, and I'd argue that sometimes they're unhealthy, veering from a desire to manipulate journalists to a belief that the media is malevolent and indeed not to be trusted. But I would argue that journalism is a force for good and can enhance the common good and encourage solidarity, whether that reporting is about aid in the developing world or the victims of abuse. Democratic nations, including the United Kingdom, your neighbours, the United States and Canada, all acknowledge the importance of the freedom of the press for the well-being of society. Well, if the Catholic Church is one thing, it's not a democracy. And I'm afraid that as an institution, it has failed too often to understand how important journalism is for its well-being. There are signs in this pontificate that may be changing, but there are also signs that we are stuck in the same groove, of which more later. But first, I'd like to examine the function of those who report on religion. A substantial number of us who do so have come to it from the secular media, and we, of course, operate within that general journalistic milieu. The values of the journalist are therefore our values. So what, in fact, are we trying to do when we report on religion? You might say that we're there to tell people what is happening in the world, that we engage in truth-telling. Truth seems a straightforward enough issue when discussing the point of journalism. Or is it? Think for a moment of a situation where you would expect to find out the truth in a court of law, spoken under oath. You'd expect the facts to be spelt out, but there might be different evidence about the case from different witnesses. You might suggest that the truth is what corresponds with the facts, then, as outlined in the case. Or you might say that something is true if those who'd experienced it endorsed it. Or you might say that truth exists if the facts or someone's beliefs fit together and are coherent. Truth-telling is more complicated than one might at first think. It becomes even more complicated if not only can you communicate with your immediate neighbour, but you've access to communication with all manner of people, when you have immense power to carry out truth-telling or indeed lying through the media. So how does the media go about communicating? Is it there to tell the truth, or is it there to do something else? And in what way does a journalist serve society? I've spent the past 30 years working as a journalist, and for much of that time I would say that the emphasis has not been on truth-telling as such, but on telling stories. That is the reason for what we do. Is it a good story? Is a question that journalists ask one another time and time again. Not that we're there to relate fiction, but real stories. Stories which are then in effect true and sometimes important. Sometimes they're not important at all, but they're interesting. Sometimes they're both. For example, you would say that it's important to tell people who won an election, and it's also interesting. But it's not very important, but quite interesting, to know that the election's vote counters are recruited from banks because they can count very fast and so have very nimble fingers. And it's really not very interesting, but terribly important, that all ballot boxes are sealed after the polls close. These criteria then, is it important, is it interesting, are vital to journalists' work and their relationship with the truth. But what is interesting and important depends on where you read the material or who you listen to. So the story that's important to the Toronto Globe and Mail is probably dull to people living in Vancouver. What matters to the readers of Dental Hygiene is irrelevant to the readers of Amateur Gardener. It means that certain stories get a particular slant according to their audience. That in turn, I would say, affects the truth of a particular story. A hypothetical story would explain this more clearly. A house burns down in Toronto, causing disruption to the traffic on Bayview Avenue for hours. It contains a dental surgery on the ground floor, where a world-famous dentist has worked for years. His wife, a prize-winning gardener, sees her life's work trampled underfoot by the firemen. The Mail runs the story, covering the loss of the dentist's surgery, the garden, and the traffic disruption. But the readers of Dental Hygiene only get the account of the loss of the surgery, and Amateur Gardener readers only hear about the loss of the prize-winning Dahlia collection. Each of these stories is true in its way, but each does distort the truth because of the emphasis. Are they then not really true, but dishonest? While this is a trivial example, it gives some insight into the way in which what might seem simple, telling what is true, is not necessarily quite so straightforward. You can see that the way journalists write stories, the narrative requirements, can in fact distort the picture or slant it in a particular way. So when Pope Francis was elected, the most important thing for the readers of La Nation in Buenos Aires was that he was Argentinian. But for the readers of America magazine, that he's a Jesuit matters most. And for Haaretz, the newspaper in Israel, his record on dialogue with Jews dominated their interest in the new Pope. The demands of news desks also serve to colour and shape the news that we read and hear, including news about religion. And with the advent of 24/7 rolling news programmes, there's been an even greater desire for drama, personality and development in stories. The leading media sources of information, newspapers, TV and radio and websites, are dominated by drama and especially political drama. Political news is characterised by rows, fallings out, failures, sackings, scandal, what's in it for the reader, and to a lesser extent, policy. In other words, political news is about success and failure. It's rare to find ideas or beliefs explored in depth. This approach is also colouring the one that news desks frequently take to religion. Religious news in the non-specialist national media is about new appointments, speculation on future appointments, rows, sackings, controversial statements, perceived attacks on other groups, be they non-believers or members of other religions. Newspapers, particularly tabloid ones, love stories that combine sex and religion, either condemnations of the teaching on it or scandals involving it. In many ways, all these approaches are entirely justified. It's understandable that readers will want to know who's likely to be the next Anglican primate, or if a bishop's in trouble, or the chief rabbi has warned anti-Semitism is on the rise and blames a growing Muslim population, or if a priest is being prosecuted for child sex abuse. However, the way in which views are reported can make for distortion. For example, in February 2009, BBC Radio's flagship Today programme asked me to comment on the row that had developed over the Catholic Church, trying to draw back into its fold the highly traditionalist group commonly known as the Lefebvrists, whose bishops included Richard Williamson, here he is, who has known anti-Semitic views. At the last minute, they dropped me because they decided it would be more balanced to have a debate between a Jewish academic and a Catholic with a strongly different view. So they invited on a Catholic who told listeners that the Pope was being compassionate to the Lefebvrists and that Bishop Williamson was really only a little local difficulty. But instead of being balanced, in many ways this was distorting because the majority of Catholics were horrified by Williamson's anti-Semitic views. Broadcasters, and you see this particularly with an organisation like the BBC, not only want balance, as in having two sides of the argument, but they want a row. A courteous discussion is dismissed as dull radio. Meanwhile, the realm of ideas remains unexplored, and so, therefore, does church teaching quite regularly in the general media. For example, when Pope Benedict visited Africa in 2009, a few comments that he made on the use or non-use of condoms in combating the spread of HIV were covered widely in the press. But later comments made by Pope Benedict during that African trip about matters such as education and women's rights were ignored completely by the secular press. This highlights how faith communities, who are often advocates for change, are given little credit for this by the media. Interestingly, some politicians, if not the media, have noticed that involvement of faith communities in change. They can court faith groups because they know they can influence voters, that those faith groups can be vehicles for change or can provide services. The Catholic Church's role in helping achieve the Millennium Development Goals, for example, was a key reason why the British government asked Pope Benedict to visit Britain in 2010. And there he is in Scotland with the Queen on that visit, which was a very successful visit. What is noticeable in the past few years is how much more interested the world's general media, that is not the specialist religious media, but the world's general media, are in religion. I suggest that three notable historical changes since the start of the 21st century have had such a significant effect to make the world's media interested in religion. Obviously, one of them is 9/11 and the rise of Islam. That's an image which I still think really does shock us all. The new atheism and aggressive secularism has had an impact on the coverage of religion, and so too has the ever faster speed in scientific development, particularly in the biological and medical sciences, with ethical consequences. This affects the reporting of issues such as assisted dying and stem cell research. Well, 9/11 caused a renewed interest in religion, but it also meant that faith is sometimes perceived through a fear of religion, particularly Islam, as a malign force. Religion is also seen by some publications as being about race relations, seeing members of particular faiths affected by hatred which is viewed as racism. Other journalists focus on religion as something which is tied up with international conflict, particularly in the Middle East. Interest in religion is also influenced by the rise of hostility to faith, which ranges from a desire for political correctness that leads to the removal of perceived special treatment of religion, to scepticism about faith's claims, and to the dismissal of believers, and also sometimes even downright hatred of religion. But in the past year, I'd say that the biggest religious story of all has been Pope Francis, and his election has changed the reporting of the Catholic Church in many ways. As you will recall, the pontificate of Benedict XVI was not always an easy one. Benedict resigned at a time when the Church was mired in controversy. There was the scandal of WikiLeaks, when documents exposing plots, rivalries and nepotism were leaked to the media. There was particular concern over the Vatican Bank, and there was the abuse crisis, which revealed in country after country that not only had priests abused children in their care, but at times their bishops had covered up the scandals. Yet Francis, from day one, has captured the imagination of the people and of the media. Why would this be? Why are the stories so positive? The simplest explanation is that Francis has a way of conveying a message, and his message and himself are one. Any advisor to a politician would tell him or her that the greatest thing you can communicate to people is authenticity. And unfortunately for them, but fortunately for us, you can't fake authenticity. When Francis speaks, you sense what you hear is what there is. He's direct, a conversational speaker who appeals both to people in the crowd and comes across powerfully through the media. And he practices what he preaches. There's a lack of pomposity denoted by how he lives in the Domus Sancta Mater, not in the Apostolic Palace. He's driven in a Ford Focus, not a limousine. He stops for a selfie. He chats animatedly to the crowd. He's supremely effective for the media because he's so visual. The Catholic Church is a huge asset in a media age in being such a visual church. Think of the grand liturgies of the Pope, any Pope, giving his blessing from a window to the crowd in St. Peter's. Think of the visual drama of the conclave, from the cardinals processing into the Sistine Chapel, to the black and white smoke of the votes, to the cardinal stepping onto the balcony and saying, "We have a Pope." But Francis' particular visual skills are for the more human moments. He's at his best in the personal encounter, whether it's washing the feet of a Muslim woman prisoner on Holy Thursday, or meeting celebrities such as Patti Smith or Lewis Hamilton, or embracing a heavily disfigured man, or holding the hand of a little child. This ability is not to be underestimated. As one of Britain's most distinguished newsreaders, the BBC's Hugh Edwards, told my publication The Tablet about Francis, it's a gift to be able to appear relaxed and quietly confident in all circumstances, and Pope Francis makes it look effortless, and this in turn affects the media's mindset. When the photo of him with the disfigured man was reproduced on the Daily Mail website, one of the most successful websites in the world, they had a record number of hits. People also left comments. "I'm an atheist, but this Pope rocks. He's renewed my faith," were typical comments from readers. And in turn, this response drove the news agenda. The Daily Mail news desk, on seeing how many hits there'd been on their site with that picture, dispatched a reporter to find the disfigured man and conducted an interview with him, and it was deeply moving as he revealed the profound impact that Francis' loving gesture had had upon him as a very lonely, excluded person. So the media is responding to Francis first and foremost as a person, not surprising when the media loves to tell stories, loves celebrities, and loves the visual. This in turn shapes the papacy and in turn religious leadership more generally. For centuries, religious leadership has been based on authority and position, the authority of office and the power of being chosen for it. It's depended on people's acknowledgement of that authority, and it's been rooted in the authority given as believers see it by God as well as by man, by tradition, by dogma. The Catholic Church is a teaching church, of course, and the Pope is there at its helm. But we're now seeing that power is also shaped by charisma. This is entirely clear with the figure of Pope Francis, and it was also apparent with John Paul II. I don't think we can say that Benedict had quite that same media force, and it's telling that a man without it chose in the end to stand down. The curious thing, though, is that public interest shaped by the media in Pope Francis means that we have an anti-celebrity as one of the greatest celebrities in the world. He rejects the trappings of success in this world, money, countless material possessions, and his focus is on those who are hungry, who are in prison, who thirst for what is right. And yet, in some ways, Francis adopts the style of a celebrity, the huge events attracting record crowds, the tours waving to the people, sharing a selfie, the special jet taking him to his major events, and the millions of followers on Twitter. Indeed, you could say this is the first Twitter papacy. Benedict did start it in the very last days of his pontificate, but it is in this one that using Twitter has so strongly developed. The problem, of course, with such a strong focus on charisma is that much of the coverage of Francis lacks insight into the rest of the story, his reform agenda. Different forms of media interpret religions by way of narratives. As I said before, the main thing about journalists is that they tell stories and they're always looking for the narrative. The main narrative about Francis is that he is an attractive, authentic individual. To a certain extent, the secular media does take on board that he has a message, that of the gospel. In this, he is no different to his predecessors, but how he conveys it is very different, plain speaking, chatty, connected to people's everyday lives. When I was in Rome on the first Sunday of Advent last year, for example, he spoke of our common journey and pilgrimage, of Advent being a time of hope. He also went on, as it was World AIDS Day, to express his closeness to those suffering from AIDS and HIV. Then he ended, as he always does with the Angelus on a Sunday, with a buon pranzo, and the crowd headed off for their lunch. The message is, I'm a normal man like you. I don't think, in a way, I could ever have even imagined Pope Benedict actually eating. He had authority as a pope, but in some ways he seemed not quite earthly. So one has to ask whether the media see what they want to see. Certainly in the UK, Pope Francis has been adopted as a darling of the left. In a world so lacking in politicians of integrity and of a clear thinking, and instead overrun with those of almost 100% pragmatism and personal ambition, Francis stands out as the man who speaks with a passion and conviction about poverty. When Tony Blair was in office in Britain, his powerful media spokesman Alastair Campbell said famously that Blair's government doesn't do God, a rather ironic statement given that that administration became embroiled in post-9/11 conflict. But Alastair Campbell, noticeably, is one of the very secular political figures in Britain who's spoken out in admiration of Francis. I'm aware, he told my publication, The Tablet, that he's developing an important voice on the issue of equality and inequality within and between nations. That's a huge issue, and he's good at it. On November the 13th last year, The Guardian, which is one of our notable left-wing papers, ran an opinion piece by its leading commentator Jonathan Friedland, headlined, Why Even Atheists Should Be Praying for Pope Francis, and with a subheading, Francis could replace Obama as the pin-up on every liberal and leftist wall. He's now the world's clearest voice for change. His gestures, said Friedland, convey a powerful message, one of almost elemental egalitarianism. He's in the business of returning the church to its core purpose, one Jesus himself might have recognised. He says he wants to preside over a poor church for the poor. It's not the institution that counts, it's the mission. Well, Friedland's admiration for a man who focuses on poverty is understandable, but what, of course, he was doing was ignoring 100 years or more of Catholic social teaching, ignoring the encyclical Caritas in Veritate, published by Benedict XVI, as a close and elegant analysis of the financial crisis. But as a Vatican staffer told The Observer, it was sometimes peculiar to hear Benedict give a speech on poverty and flagrant materialism, and then see him whisked away in a cavalcade of 20 limousines. Benedict and his key aides, this Vatican man told The Observer, didn't see the irony. In the past few weeks, a considerable amount has been published about Pope Francis in the wake of the first anniversary of his election. Much of it has been about his gift for communication, his authenticity, the impact he's having on the church, his speaking out for people, particularly the poor, and his "who am I to judge" comment about gay people. So why does the mainstream media, the major newspapers, radio and TV stations, devote so little space to his reform agenda? It may be that how the church is run is deemed too esoteric for most readers and viewers. It's complex and takes up too much time and space to explain. It's going to take time to reform the Vatican's governance, and in a world that has instant news and instant change as top of its agenda, those are what grab the headlines. But the reforms that Francis has begun, freeing himself from the gatekeepers and schedulers that surround the Pope in the Apostolic Palace, shifting the clericalist ethos with which the Vatican is imbued, curtailing centralisation by forming his group of 8 cardinal advisors. All these are the most significant changes in Rome in 50 years and will shape the church for years to come. It's been left to the specialist religious press to keep people abreast of these days in Rome. So that brings me to consider the role of the specialist religious outlets, including my own publication, The Tablet. And there's a recent cover. We have a somewhat different role, of course, to the general media, a responsibility to be journals of record. Websites have enabled religious publications to be instant in their reporting. Journals like my own and America Magazine also provide more space to explore ideas, beliefs and theology. Yet we too cover the rows, the speculation and the scandal, because while we should be wary of using political reporting as a template, they do form the warp and weft of religion as well. But the treatment of scandals, I would hope, tends to be more sober. What we do has changed dramatically in recent years. We take 5 days to produce a weekly publication. In that time, billions of tweets will have been produced, some of them by us, as well as vast amounts of content on Facebook, Pinterest, Reddit and other sites. The rolling news of TV and radio ploughs on. Plenty of publications have gone to the wall in this time. We need to be positioned to avoid that, and talented staff and contributors, as well as loyal readers, are crucial. But survival requires more than this. It also requires a clear reason for our existence. In business terms, that means we need to be a strong brand, and as a small publication, have a clear niche appeal. But as a Catholic publication, it's about much more than this. When I took over the editorship of The Tablet 10 years ago, I wrote a leader setting out my philosophy, which for all the digital changes still stands today. Our task, I said, was to explain, illuminate and interpret the journey of Catholics. We're a paper of responsible Catholic thinking, a place where orthodoxy is at home but ideas are welcome. I also pointed out that the Tablet is not run by the church hierarchy, something that allows it a privileged perspective, but such a privilege must not be abused, it must be cherished. This does not always make for an easy life. There are people who don't think a Catholic paper should challenge the Church at all. When, for example, I took part in a television programme about the future of the Church during the run-up to the last conclave, I was vilified by some conservative bloggers for suggesting that the Church might look again at mandatory celibacy and that the time has come to think about married priests. Of course, now we hear suggestions that Francis himself is perhaps talking about this, but then celibacy is a discipline rather than dogma. I have to say, though, that in this pontificate there is an atmosphere of greater openness to discussion and debate. Francis encourages frankness by his own freedom. If I'd put a leader in the tablet in years past saying the court is the leprosy of the papacy, I would have been blasted to kingdom come by outraged bloggers. But it's Francis himself, the Pope, who's saying it. What his own comments make plain is how important it is for viewpoints, however critical, to be constructive. Francis' opinions are part of his drive for reform. Vilification of individuals or organisations is not acceptable in a specialist Christian publication, but critiquing them is. The tablet has always set out, and this is vital for all religious media, to not forget that people's faith never lives in isolation. So our purpose and our mission needs to place that faith in the contemporary social and political context. There's a back and forth relationship here. Religious matters are not viewed in isolation, but we try to bring a rather different ethical perspective to more secular issues as well. For example, when we report on the forthcoming synod on family life, in which divorce will be discussed, it would be odd not to place it in the context of overall divorce and remarriage rates in society. But when we report on what the government is doing about poverty, we'd use Catholic social teaching to analyse the justice of its position. One danger that all of us involved in reporting the Catholic Church must be aware of is the tendency to be ultramontane, to focus on the Pope and the Vatican when the Church is so much more than what happens in Rome. This can be a danger when one is concerned at what the Pope is doing, Benedict's flirtation with the arch-conservative Lefebvre, for example, or when one is enthusiastic about a reforming Pope. The Catholic Church is much greater than just this, and we need to focus on the faith and work of its members around the world. And yet, when the hierarchy is so important and what it does shapes the Church and therefore has the most important impact on people's lives, we do have to look at what they're about. So I'd like to examine here one of the most disturbing issues of recent times regarding both the Church's standing and its relationship with the media, the abuse crisis. The crisis has understandably received massive coverage from the general media. Since the first revelations by the Boston Globe in 2002, there have been disclosures in the United States, Ireland, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, Germany and France of sexual and physical abuse by Catholic priests. The incidents have ranged from gropings to rape. The victims were male and female, and while there have been no revelations of paedophile rings, it's become apparent from international press coverage that church authorities often knew of the abuse, but their interventions commonly involved moving priests around. This only served to enable the abuser to target new victims elsewhere. The Catholic Church used its own canon law as a basis for action rather than cooperating with the police. And in fact, we're seeing that view still in Italy today, with Cardinal Bagnasco of their Bishops' Conference saying that the Church doesn't need to cooperate with the police. Revelations about abuse do go back decades. The media's way of dealing with this has made me proud to be a journalist. In various countries, but particularly in the United States and Ireland, it took the media's involvement to reveal patterns of sexual abuse and misgovernance by bishops, who not only failed to tackle the issue, but made it worse by recycling abusers into church ministry, and they failed to come to grips with the psychosexual problems of their pastors, their criminal activity, and the collapse of discipline. the consequent failure to care for victims was also deeply shocking. But this story has also made me ashamed at times to be a journalist as well. It's deeply concerned me about my profession. Sometimes the abuse crisis has been seized upon in such a way that journalists have used it to attack the Catholic Church as if it is the epicentre of child sexual abuse. But abuse of children occurs in families as well as schools, care homes and youth organisations. It's there in those setups run by other denominations and, of course, by secular authorities. The common denominator in these cases appears to be the power of the abuser and the desire to avoid scandal. When it came to the media's portrayal of the Catholic Church and abuse, it often presented that church as a vast ecclesiastical conspiracy with little reference to the fact that many of these cases are decades old and that attempts have been made in countries such as Britain to tackle the crisis. This became particularly clear in the spring of 2010, when media across the globe turned on the church, suggesting that Pope Benedict was party to a vast church cover-up. In Germany, where cases had shocked devout churchgoers, Der Spiegel newspaper called for the Pope's resignation, and there were similar demands from the press in Ireland, where some of the most appalling abuses occurred. And these were finally documented in a series of devastating reports. Well, as head of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, Pope Benedict, then Cardinal Ratzinger, had read files on abusive priests. Just days before he was elected Pope, he'd spoken of the filth in the church. Papers like the New York Times gave him little credit, but there are smaller voices, some of them unexpected, who cut him some slack. Thomas Rees, for example, a former editor of the Jesuit weekly America and long a critic of Joseph Ratzinger, has pointed out that as Cardinal Ratzinger, he supported the American bishops when they advocated a zero-tolerant approach to abusive priests, refusing to allow them a return to ministry. And of course, Pope Benedict took action against Father Martial Maciel, a notorious abuser who founded the Legionaries of Christ order and funded the church. How the media reported on Pope Benedict, who for many of them could do nothing right, and how the media reported on Pope Francis, shows that once a person is labelled in the most simplistic terms by some of the media as a good or bad guy, well, it sticks. Pope Francis has barely attracted any criticism at all since he was elected Pope, even though he gave an interview to the Italian paper Corriere della Sera when he said, "The Catholic Church is maybe the only public institution to have moved with transparency and responsibility. No one else has done more, yet the Church is the only one to be attacked." Well, that, I think quite a few people felt wasn't entirely telling it as it is. But there wasn't the same fanfare of criticism of Francis as there would have been of Benedict. Of course, there has been movement on the abuse crisis, which has been reported. There's the Abuse Commission that Cardinal O'Malley of Boston's been involved in. This is a photograph of abuse victims protesting, which has appeared frequently in the media. Since the Abuse Commission that Cardinal O'Malley's been involved in setting up, we now have 8 members selected, 5 of whom are lay people, and 4 of those in turn are women, including a victim of abuse. So you can say that we're making progress, and the media has approached that favourably. But sometimes in media terms, it's the most simplest things that really make for the most effective action by the Church. You may remember that in February this year, there was a UN report on the Catholic Church that was published, which heavily criticised the way it had dealt with abuse. The Vatican, in responding to that, became instantly defensive, immediately feeling that the UN was out to get it, and that determined how it approached the way it responded in the media. But there was a very significant moment, I think, on TV involving Father Thomas Rosica. Some of you may well know of him because he runs Salt and Light TV here in Toronto. And I watched him on TV in Britain. I think it was an interview that was then seen elsewhere, where he spoke about this UN report. And there was also an abuse victim in the studio. And the abuse victim was interviewed and Father Rosica was interviewed. And Father Rosica then, during the course of this programme, spoke to the young man by name, and he told him that what had happened to him was disgusting, it was sinful, and it was unacceptable, and he apologised to him as a priest and representative of the church. And the young man's face at that moment was completely transformed. Later at the tablet, we tracked down that young man and asked him about what had happened. And he said it was the first time in 16 years since he was abused, the first time in 16 years that anyone from the church had apologised to him for what had happened. So there you can see how the media can have the most incredible power to bring people together and transform the agenda. And of course, as a teaching authority, the church has long encouraged the importance of solidarity with one another. Whether it's telling people about the plight of Sri Lankans affected by a tsunami, or African farmers whose livelihoods are under threat from extreme weather caused by climate change, or about the victims of abuse, the media can enhance our connection with people we must stand with and support. In that sense, the media can undoubtedly be a power for good. Yet there are many people who don't see it that way. I'd like to draw their attention to a rather forgotten pastoral instruction, Communio et Progressio, published in 1971 during the papacy of Paul VI, which expanded the thinking of the Second Vatican Council fathers on the media. It made it plain that Catholics need information to play an active role in the church because, quote, the development of public opinion within the church is essential, and the normal flow of life and the smooth functioning of government within the church require a steady two-way flow of information between ecclesiastical authorities at all levels and the faithful as individuals and as organised groups. What Communio et Progressio had to say about the importance of the church being open about what it does is of immense significance, and one wonders to what extent it has been forgotten over the years, given how reluctant the church has been, for example, over the abuse crisis, to be open. Communio et Progressio says, the spiritual riches which are an essential attribute of the church demand that the news she gives out of her intentions as well as of her works be distinguished by integrity, truth and openness. When ecclesiastical authorities are unwilling to give information or are unable to do so, then rumour is unloosed, and rumour is not a bearer of the truth, but carries dangerous half-truths. If we think again of the title of this document, Communio et Progressio, it shows that the Council Fathers understood how vital communication is. Titling it Communio et Progressio, Unity and Progress, recognises humanity's capacity through the sharing of knowledge to build bridges between peoples. But this document sets the bar very high. Communication, it says, is more than the expression of ideas and the indication of emotion. At its most profound level, it is the giving of self in love. I find it particularly appealing that this document describes Christ as revealing himself as the perfect communicator, because he utterly identified himself with those who were to receive his communication, and he gave his message not only in words, but in the whole manner of his life. He spoke from within, that is to say, from out of the press of his people. The authors of this document say he preached the divine message without fear or compromise. He adjusted to his people's way of talking and to their patterns of thought, and he spoke out of the predicament of their time. Well, that would be an example for any journalist to follow, and shows why religion and the media need not be uncomfortable bedfellows. Many of those in positions of power in religious organisations are suspicious of the media's liberal thinking in its belief in freedom of speech and in what they see as a challenge to authority, while thinking that they themselves have a special relationship to the truth. But in a church like the Catholic Church, lay people have little by way of any official or recognised forum. That's another vital reason why ideas and opinions should be expressed through the media. It's a way of bearing witness to justice and peace, goodwill and charity, and so enhances the common good. Thank you very much. I'm going to come back. I haven't finished yet.
No, you're not finished. Catherine has agreed to take questions. So we have one microphone in the middle and two on the aisles. And please feel free to come forward and ask questions. I'll just ask you to be concise so that we can get as many people in as possible. Thank you.
Yes, Catherine, I was wondering if you could, I know that personnel issues are sometimes confidential, but if you could fill us in a little bit on Robert Mickens' suspension from the tablet.
That is a very difficult thing to talk about, because there is a human resources matter going on at the moment. I can really only repeat what we've said in the tablet. Robert Mickens has worked for the tablet for some time, and he has done many valuable things for the tablet. But unfortunately, he engaged in a conversation on Facebook, which was offensive and disrespectful, and we felt could not be tolerated, and so we needed to examine what had happened and what we should do about it. And we haven't completed that process, so I can't tell you any more about it right now. But I think what it shows is that if you are a commentator or a journalist, you can't. I personally don't think you can say one thing in one area and be a public figure somewhere else. People see you as a whole. There is, to use that famous quote of Colin Bundon, there's a seamless robe. If I say one thing as the editor of the tablet and I say something privately or semi-publicly and it gets known, I will be judged for that as well. So it is problematic if people make comments which affect how you're perceived, how your publication is perceived. So we had to take what was said that was offensive very seriously indeed. And we're still in the middle of that. And it's deeply regrettable, I think, that somebody associated with the tablet would say such things.
I'm not a lawyer, but I've been told that the lawyers tell officials from the church never to say you're sorry, because that's an admission of guilt. Can you comment on that?
I think it's been evident in some of the abuse cases that what the church's response at times has been down to what their insurers have said. And that has affected sometimes the way things have been done. However, with that example I gave of Father Thomas Rosica, a simple apology can work absolute wonders. And it seems to me to be the response we would all prefer than to be governed by what your insurance company tells you. Mm-hmm. I prepared this talk a while back, but in fact today Pope Francis himself made an apology to victims of abuse during a session with an organisation to do with children in Rome today, which was not expected. It wasn't in the speech that was released. It was an impromptu apology that he made on behalf of the church. But meantime, Cardinal Bagnasco, who's head of the Italian Bishops' Conference, has still been saying recently that the church needn't cooperate with any police investigations into abuse cases. So I think people feel there's rather mixed messages coming out.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was very enlightening. I mean, the tablet has been around for years, and I presume it'll be around for another few years. What is if you were to give us a prognosis of where the tablet's going to be, say, in 10 to 20 years, where do you think that will be? It seems that the tablet has survived the 24-hour news cycle. You have an online presence. It's a very sort of nice website, sort of very contemporary. How do you see the sort of moderately rapid changes in journalism affecting this very, in some respects, traditional approach to getting your message out weekly? Where do you see yourself going?
It's if I could give you the answer to that in terms of how to guarantee a successful media operation, I don't think I'd be working for the tablet anymore. I'd be hired by giant media organisations, and I'd be paid the most vast salary I could possibly imagine. That is the key question that every media organisation wants to be able to answer. You mentioned we've been going for some time, and Christina did as well. And next year we'll be marking 175 years of continuous publication. And of course, we really do want to get to at least 200 years of continuous publication. I think in some ways it's a little bit easier for you if you are a niche publication. You have something that's a bit different to other people. Whereas if you're a newspaper and then you're also trying to produce 24-hour news covering every possible thing that you can, how do you cope and compete with another huge media organisation like the BBC, for example? That's very, very difficult. But if you're doing something that lots of other people aren't doing, that helps. You've got something that's worthwhile. What we've been known for is, over the years, I'd say, is not only news about the church and about, slightly broader than just the church, sort of religious and ethical matters, but we've been known for deeper analysis rather than just not just straight reporting. And I think we need to maintain that, because although we live in a world where people want opinions in 140 characters via Twitter, there is still a constituency out there for deeper thinking as well. And I think we have to do that. Meantime, we have to use these other quicker media forms to attract people to what we do. So what we need to do is intertwine all these outlets so that some people will find the tablet through Twitter, some through Facebook, some through a traditional print edition. What I think may well happen 25 years hence is that people won't necessarily want to hold the publication in their hands, but they'll still want something that comes in once a week, but that they download. And we are starting to see a growth in our online-only subscribers. And I think particularly for people around the world, you don't want to get their weekly edition arriving 5 days late because of the mail. They get it straight away.
So just a bit of a quick follow-up then. You mentioned the niche market, and that's kind of why I rushed up here what do you see as unique? You kind of got at that. Which leads to another question. When I think of the tablet, I then sort of put that into another range of publications that I enjoy reading, including American, National Catholic Reporter, Commonweal, and so on. So how do you work with those sort of, if I can say it, like-minded publications? Are you in competition with them? Are you in solidarity with them? Are you exchanging business plans? What's your relationship with those other fine publications?
Well, we don't share business plans. We're not quite a cartel.
Well, I didn't think so.
It's a mix of both of the other two, really, of competition. Very occasional, sometimes cooperation. So we're all keeping an eye on one another, and we're sort of reasonably friendly towards one another, but it doesn't go further than that. The one thing that has also changed that I haven't mentioned, which ties in with what we're talking about here, is the extent to which the church itself and other organisations that we report on put out their own information. So the Vatican, to take an example, has effectively got 2 websites. It's got one which is absolutely awful in terms of being very, very hard to use. It's like opening a trunk and sort of pulling out bits and pieces, trying to find what's buried in there. And then there's another website they've got which is really excellent and very, very clear. And so if all people want is to read, say, Pope Francis' homilies, then that's a great website to go to. But if they want some analysis and some sort of interpretation or some explanation of what he's saying or how this should be placed in certain context, then you still need publications. But that is a huge area of growth, organisations' own forms of media.
Hello. I'm not sure what the situation might be in Great Britain, but it would be an observation of mine that here in Canada, when it comes to media coverage of religion, the Catholic Church is it. You don't see much coverage of any other of the denominations here in Canada, and in the States too, the Catholic Church seems to get the bulk of the coverage. I'm wondering what that might say about the discourse in the public sphere, that we seem to be, for better or worse, the only voice or the only voice that is heard.
When you say that, do you mean that the other denominations are ignored, whether it's a good news story or a bad news story? Just overall, it's the Catholic Church that gets reported on, or?
That would be my observation, yes.
Yeah. Okay. In the UK, it's a bit different because we have an established church, and the Church of England, even though it has, I think today, no more practicing members of the Church of England than the Catholic Church has practicing members. It still has a big influence, and so if the Archbishop of Canterbury has something to say about the government's welfare changes, then people pay attention to that, and there's a lot of interest in whoever the Archbishop of Canterbury is. So it's slightly different in the UK. The other Christian denominations, no, they're not covered in the same way. I suppose it's partly for some of the reasons I was talking about earlier. There's a drama about the Catholic Church that has that attracts attention. I mean, choosing a pope, just something as basic as that, is an incredibly dramatic event. It makes for great TV, and so that kind of thing, understandably, gets the media excited. I suppose it also, when the media is interested in the Catholic Church, it's recognising its power and influence as well. I mean, I'd be interested to hear about Canada, but certainly in the UK, the other thing that we have a lot of coverage of is Islam, but that's usually stories about people's fears, I'd say, or at the very local level, it's about in a local newspaper, it'll be about people complaining about a new mosque being built, or the noise of people being called to prayer, or at a greater level, it's about is our society changing? Should Muslims have their own schools? A lot of the reporting of Islam is dominated by people's fears, and it's not a religion that people know a great deal about, and I don't think the media is playing any part in informing people about it either, particularly.
Thank you. Thank you for your remarks tonight. I very much enjoyed them. My question pertains to what I see as a severe underreporting by the media of the level of persecution of Christians, and very much including Catholics in that around the world. It's happening in many countries, Syria, a number of African countries. There was another priest killed in his church in Pakistan the other day. There's a huge amount of such mistreatment and persecution, and yet the general media, to me, is virtually ignoring it. If the media want stories, as you've mentioned, there's many stories in that area that are there for their reporting. Could you comment on that issue of persecution, please?
Well, I agree with you. I'd hope that that's something where certainly the specialist religious press is different. I mean, we've written a lot about the persecution of Christians in the tablet, and particularly the way in which the Christian population of the Middle East is practically disappearing, and the extent to which those people are being persecuted and are suffering in all kinds of countries there. I mean, we've seen that happen in Iraq, that Christians have gone from a place where they've been for so long, and now the same is happening in Syria. Why does the general media not show so much interest in that? It's difficult to say. I mean, to a certain extent, sometimes in Britain that is reported. I think the BBC's been quite good on that. I think because there's been more focus on the politics of the region rather than the human story, which would include the persecution of those Christians. I can't imagine that people on news desks in big media organisations sit there and say, "How dull, Christians persecuted." But I think it's because their focus is on something else. Interestingly, that story of persecution of Christians did get a lift in the general media in Britain a short while ago when Prince Charles hosted an event where he brought a lot of people together to talk about that issue and made a speech about it. And he also visited some refugees from persecuted Christian groups, and it got it on the agenda for a bit. But again, it was going into it because it's Prince Charles, i.e. a personality who's taken this up. They got interested in it. But it is a very disappointing thing that it's not better covered. But I don't really have an explanation as to why.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for your talk. I found it very interesting when you were talking about the different roles or the differences between mainstream or general media and then the niche media or Catholic media. And when you spoke about the sexual abuse scandal and the role of the general media in unearthing that scandal, it reminded me, I agreed with you, and it reminded me of how important media is in our society as a tool or as a medium to keep us, to call to account organizations, governments, people, what have you. But I'm wondering, did the Catholic media or the niche media, did it abdicate its responsibility in the sexual abuse scandal? Should it not have reported that story first, maybe? Or if not first, perhaps because of a lack of resources, at least taken on that story to a greater degree than it did?
Well, the abuse scandal exposés began before I worked for the tablet. So I mentioned 2002, the Boston Globes got going on that. However, I do know that in Britain, the tablet under my predecessor was one of the first publications in Britain to report on it. There was a couple of individuals who that the tablet particularly wrote about. And there's a book that's just been published by a lawyer who's acted for a lot of victims over the years, and he refers to the tablet's involvement in getting that story going in Britain. So I can only salute my predecessor editor for what he did on that. I think there's a more general point to be made about calling to account with journalism, which is that calling to account can take a huge effort. It requires a lot of staff to do a job thoroughly. And that means a lot of resources, and a lot of the specialist religious publications don't have big resources. They don't have big investigative teams of journalists. They don't necessarily have the backup of lawyers who work for them to help them see their way through. So I think that can play a part. When you work in a specialist area, whether it's reporting on religion or reporting on transport or I don't know, a sport like fishing or whatever, you're in a difficult situation. It's a bit of a kind of high wire act all the time, in that the people you report on are also your readers, and they're your contacts. And if a newspaper like The Guardian reports on the Catholic Church, it doesn't really have the same impact on it if it alienates that organisation. Whereas if the tablet reports on the Catholic Church and alienates lots of members of that church in senior positions, it's very difficult to keep doing what you're doing if nobody will talk to you anymore. So it's a very fine act of being both doing what you're there to do, but also ensuring that you can keep doing it. So I don't know, but maybe that's why some specialist press, when it came to the abuse saga, didn't do what some of the bigger papers like the Boston Globe did as well. I can actually sit down. Goodness me. Thank you very much. There's one thing I want to say, because we have to talk about the abuse costs. Just one thing very quickly, and I hope I don't know if this came out of my talk, but I think I should say this as well. One thing as a Catholic paper one has to try and do is also report on what the Church does that is really inspiring, because it isn't all about child abuse. I mean, there really is the most fantastic work and service that the Church provides in all sorts of ways, and we need to remember to celebrate that as well as write about the bad stuff.
Just on that very point. Yeah. Well, I was thinking about it. You even brought it up yourself about Islam, and I know the tablet's a Catholic paper, so if you want to make comparisons and show, like, one of the things that actually Pope Francis and different popes have been trying to get is communication. That's a terrific opportunity, not only with Islam, with Judaism, Christianity, and all of the different sects of any of those. You don't see much of that, though. Why?
You don't see much of it. Why?
The reporting even on how it goes together, like they maybe have a talk or a speech, but that's as far as it goes. And unless you actually hunt up that actual talk, you never hear much about it. I'm thinking of the register here, but and what I'm saying, maybe your point about you're isolating some of the people that you want want their communication, that may be a part of the problem.
I think we do a fair amount of reporting about interfaith dialogue in the tablet. I mean, I published a big piece from a Jewish writer the other week about the way in which Jewish people and Jewish theologians are increasingly interested in Jesus as a prophet, and something like that is about making connections.
So now I'd like to invite forward Father Con O'Mahony. He's the Vicar of Education for the Diocese of Hamilton. He's the Bishop's representative on the St. Jerome's University Board of Governors. And he's the pastor at St. Michael's Church. And he has nothing else to do tonight except come and formally thank our speaker on our behalf.
Thank you. As somebody who likes media and somebody who, especially on a Saturday morning, likes to spend an hour or two at William's Coffee Pub or Angie's Kitchen going over the newspapers, and feels like throwing up his omelette, especially when our local paper or one of our national papers gets the religion story wrong, Catherine, it was wonderful to have you here this evening because you talked about the media to us and gave us information and background that I think is very, very important for us because we are in a new time in the church. And maybe there is a new conversation, there's a new dialogue that we need to have among ourselves, and that it may be possible for us to engage our media in as well. And so rather than getting so upset with Rex Murphy's latest foray into religious matters, maybe it would be an opportunity to either pray for him or invite him for a scotch. I think you did something else for us as well, and that is to emphasize the importance of Catholic media. In Canada, it's a difficulty. It is a great difficulty, but there is good Catholic media that we should pursue, like the tablet. And the third thing that I'm leaving this evening with is I think it's the challenge to the Catholic community to tell the Catholic story that is the local Catholic story. And it was marvelous to have you here on a day in particular that there is a great story being told here at St. Jerome's University, where the university, with great confidence and with great courage, looks forward to a long and successful future as it goes into its building campaign. And so if we don't see an article about it tomorrow in the KW Record, the editor will be getting a lot of telephone calls, hopefully. So thank you so much for inviting us to an active engagement in this very important issue.
Well, maybe the tablet will beat the record to talking about St. Jerome's University, because Catherine has a little notebook that she's been talking to a bunch of us all day today, so there should be something coming out in the tablet one of these days. Yeah. A couple of more things before we finish up this evening. First of all, I want to thank all the people who contributed to this special fund in memory of Dr. Michael Higgins, a past president of St. Jerome's University, because it's that fund that makes it possible for us to examine the relationship between religion and the media each year. So we thank those contributors. Every year, St. Jerome's University is pleased to present a program of speakers to our community. We're able to provide these lectures to the community at no charge, thanks to the generosity of so many partners and supporters. If you would like to support these lectures, there are some donation envelopes here on some of the chairs here in Siegfried. There are also some on the table in the foyer. And I want to thank you so much to all those who give so generously to us. I want to remind you to sign up in the foyer if you would like to receive the latest information about this lecture series and regular email updates about speakers as they're coming. Also, to let us know if you would like to hear about other lectures and events that are taking place at St. Jerome's. There are a number of great fairly traded products available for sale in the foyer by our Worshiping Community Social Justice Committee. So please, coffee, tea, chocolate, some things you can prepare for some Easter gifts maybe that you want to give. We're happy to have our local independent bookseller Wordsworth Books with us. So they're in the foyer with lots of books related to this lecture series and some books by our speakers. And finally, I wanted to let you know that our next lecture will be on Friday, April the 25th. Franciscan Sister Ilia Delio, who is the Director of Catholic Studies at Georgetown University, will be with us this year to present the Ignatian lecture entitled Rethinking Catholicity in an Evolving World. Dr. Delio will bring her extensive experience in the areas of science and theology, especially her work on Teilhard de Chardin, to this lecture, where she's going to help us to think about this dynamic principle of Catholicity within the context of evolution. I also wanted to let you know that St. Jerome's University is one of the sponsors for a workshop that Dr. Delio will be leading the next day at St. Bridget's Villa, located at the Ignatius Jesuit Center in Guelph. So if you are at all interested in that, there are still a few spots remaining and you have to reserve a spot and make your payments and so on. There are some flyers out in the hallway that you can pick up that give you information about how you can register for that. So all of that information. I look forward to seeing you hopefully on Friday, April the 25th. Thank you so much for coming and being with us this evening. Have please a safe trip home, and until next time, good night.